psychotic men to the ground. She admitted once she didn't have anything to restrain one patient with. So, she tied his hands up with her shoelaces and pinned him down until the men hired to restrain patients came upstairs. As I mentioned before, my mother was less prissy than the other nurses. So, she was often the one to clean up the dead bodies. Most nurses would throw all the dead patients' belonging in the garbage bags the hospital had for patient families' pickups. My mother said she always made sure to get decent red or black bags from the dollar store and neatly fold and wrap everything. She was class. Anyway, she also had to wash the bodies. She admitted that it is really hard to wash a dead body after rigor mortis since it would be hard to get into crevices. However, before she could start washing, she usually had to put patients' dentures in. If the patient didn't have their dentures put in before rigor mortis, the funeral home would have to break their jaw to give them their teeth. After she was done washing the body, putting the teeth in and cleaning the rooms, my mother had to take the bodies downstairs to the basement, where it was cold, empty for storage and had all the toe tags. Since my mom didn't like wheeling the dead bodies all the way down, which are very heavy, she would go into the elevator. Now imagine being a 20-something-year-old nurse in a small, white elevator with the dead body of a mental patient. Not fun. On my mother's first time doing this, the body had a severe muscle spasm after death. So, imagine everything I said before, except now the dead body is twitching and making groaning noises, not ah or oh noises, gurgling. And she had to stand there in the elevator for a good solid 2 minutes while this thing twitched and flopped. Then she took it into a basement where there was no one around, except the bodies of 3 other dead patients and the room where they performed the lobotomies. Not fucking fun. Back to the lobotomy room. My mother was being trained to help perform lobotomies. She said that even though she was only trained in nursing, they were teaching her to use a saw to cut through the skull of the head. Then the doctor would use a smaller knife to hack around the brain, then make his incision. She said she was never trained to do the lobotomies where the ice pick goes through the side of the eye. Before my mother could properly use her training, the lobotomies stopped being performed at her hospital. They were moved to another city nearby. My mother also witnessed a murder. While she was pregnant with me, she worked the night shift, and apparently always ate broccoli and cheese with her nurse friend and a few patients. One night, she heard running water from one of the patient's cells. She goes in to find this woman running the knife under the water. The woman would later admit that she went and bought a serrated knife. Therefore I'm assuming she was there voluntarily. The knife is covered with these fat chunks, and the sink is clogging up with this orangey red water. My mom stands there and watches the woman and finally asks her for the knife. And without reacting at all, the woman hands the knife to my mother and says, "Here you go." Then the woman asked my mom if she could clean up her cell so she could go back to bed. My mother's friend and co-worker then goes into the woman's cell to clean it up. When she walks in, she finds that the woman decapitated her roommate while she slept. I don't know how the woman could get away with hacking another woman's head off with a kitchen knife, but her head was covered with a pillow and the victim was heavily sedated. The murderer, as my mother described her, was this big fat lady. And apparently, she had eyes that looked through you. She never smiled, and was always glaring at people. The victim was actually a former Catholic school teacher to my mother. Apparently, she had some sort of cold sore that turned into some sort of syphilis or some crap. Anyway, she had some sort of contagious disease that caused her to have abnormalities in the brain which led her to be insane. However, she was always happy and smiling. She sang piano. She was a former school teacher to my mother and always talked about going back to teach her students about music. She used to prance and sing all the time. Her husband would often come to the asylum to visit her, and let her, who was entirely psychotic, drive the car around the premises while she sung. She spoke in songs. Another one of my mother's patients was a young woman responsible for shooting her mother in the head. The patient was watching television in her bedroom. She was in her early 20s, back in the 1950s. She just got up, grabbed her father's pistol and put the gun behind her mother's ear and fired. She was placed into an asylum. By the time my mother started working there, roughly 30 years had passed. Legally, this woman could now leave and her place in the asylum was voluntary. But she didn't want to leave. Said she still felt guilty and that she was too bad to ever be part of regular society. She never forgave herself for what she did, even though she wasn't in the right mind and was convinced her mother was an alien or a monster or something. But she was always intensely nice. She made my mother tea doilies, which we still use, and sweaters. This woman made me my baby blanket. One patient hated my mother with a passion. He said that all women were whores and didn't like it how she tried to boss a man around, by making him take his meds and not fucking beat on other patients. So, he was your typical, tard. But in an insane asylum in the 1980s. Anyway, he was a convicted murderer, killed a man when he was in his late teens. He was legally allowed to leave in his mid-40s. Before he left, he told my mother that he hated her so much he'd murder her and her family. Back then it was just my mom and dad pre-divorce and my older sister. All because she was a woman who told him to stop being crazy and take his fucking meds. To save herself time, my mother lived near the asylum. Now, either he saw her, or he found about her in some sort of directory, because he found where she lived. My mother said she saw him at least 5 times in the months after he was let from the asylum. The police told her he was working a job and every psychiatrist in the hospital said he was stable. So, they pretty much told her to shut up. My mother started locking the doors and windows excessively. One day, my mother heard a loud bang from upstairs in my sister's room. She then heard my sister crying and screaming louder than usual. So, my mother grabbed a broom and rushed upstairs saying, "I have a fucking gun." When she made it upstairs, my older sister was lying on the middle of the floor with a bruise on her tummy and sobbing. The window had been forced open. After that, we moved into the house I grew up in. My mother took my father's name, and kept it after the divorce, and removed her name from the phone books and directories available. We never heard from him again. Another one of my mom's patients was an amazing artist only at 17. He would draw intensely detailed pictures of Jesus on the cross, close-ups of the nails in Christ's hands, the thorns going into his forehead, complete with pores dripping sweat, etc., Satan, Roman soldiers torturing Christ, one even detailing an assault of Christ, the adulterous woman being beaten before being handed over onto Christ, things like that. He would also draw pictures of hell and demons, sometimes involving himself. He could sometimes draw beautiful things. He liked my mother quite a bit, and, from memory, painted a lifelike portrait of her. He also drew her butterflies and flowers. Nice pleasant stuff. But usually, he would flip out halfway through a nice picture and start drawing disturbing imagery over top. Like, a beautiful skyline that gradually shifts into a hellish, barren landscape. He would often cry and tell my mother the disturbing things he painted were what he saw each and every day. He told her he tried to visualize nice things that made him happy, but the bad things would distort and engulf them. Eventually he was put on medication, and his psychosis, and his talent, evaporated. My mother asked him if it made him sad to go from being a stunning realist to unable to draw a straight line. He said he didn't care because he wasn't seeing those horrible images anymore. Although he explained to her his plans to go to art school and become a professional artist. My mom once, as a young woman, had to go alone into a room with a convicted apist and murderer on multiple women. Who was unrestrained, she said feels intensely uncomfortable, man. She also worked with regular pyromaniacs. She said they usually were very condescending and stuck up. My mother said that a lot of the sociopaths, pyromaniacs, murderers, apists, animal torturers, were very full of themselves. They thought themselves to be smarter than everyone else, even though they got caught. They tried to play Hannibal Lecter-styled mind games, before the movie came out, but would usually just come off as stupid, tards. Occasionally they could cut deep. But usually since they had such little understanding of human emotion due to their psychosis, they often failed to be genuinely insulting. Just creepy and rude. My mother started doing work outside of the asylum. She has this one patient I'll tell you about. She was adopted by a military family. When she was 14, she met a senior in high school who took an interest in her. The senior boy asked her out on a date, and gave her this cheap, oversized ring. She rolled tape around her fingers to make sure the stupid thing fit. One day he asked her to come. All the other girls at school warned her not to go with this guy. But she was unpopular, a virgin and wanted a boy to like her. So, she went. It turned out to be a biker hangout. Where I live in Canada, bikers are a problem. A whole group of men ages 20 to 40 just started violently ganging up on this one little 14-year-old girl. Apparently, it was the senior boy's job to go find young girls who low self-esteem, make them like him, and trick them into going to their hangout. She never told her family for reasons of personal shame. As an adult, she started drinking heavily and having sex with a lot of men. She became pregnant and had a baby girl. She started bringing men back to her house for sex. One who may have attacked her 7-month baby girl while she was having a psychotic meltdown and staring at the ceiling. The baby was found starving, bleeding and with bed sores. The child was removed. The woman went through a cycle of homelessness and asylum which did nothing to help her in the real world. So now she's an alcoholic who looks 70 even though she's in her early 40s. My mother started working with her through a social program. She tends to have little freak-outs when my mother takes her to her appointments. She would start screaming about how there were germs in the air and how she is being watched and is dying and all that. My mother responds by telling her to stop acting crazier than you are, and to shut the hell up. You're scaring the small children. She tends to blow most of her money on booze, unfortunately. With her small check, she went and bought 5 Texas Mickeys. Now, before I continue, I am not a drinker. Nothing against booze, I just never liked the taste or the feeling. I'm a sad, sick drunk as well as a lightweight. So, any errors I make, please excuse. So, my mother asks her what the 5 giant Texas goddamn Mickeys in the corner of the room are. Here's the dialogue. What are those?
Nothing.
Those looks like booze bottles.
Well, they're not.
They